Hello everybody, welcome to Clare and welcome to everybody joining us online as well. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Christine Blanshard today. So before I do, just a little bit of background. In March 2018, 2 patients were admitted to Salisbury District Hospital critically ill due to poisoning with nerve agent Novichok. A police officer was also poisoned and required admission to intensive care, and another individual was treated as an outpatient for local effects of contact with the agent. Thankfully, all made a full recovery. However, in June 2018, 2 other victims, apparently unconnected with the first, were also admitted, and one of these did die. Debriefs, learning events, and further investigations continued into 2019. The inquest into Dawn Sturgess' death opened in 2020 and the public inquiry is still ongoing. As medical director of the Trust, closely involved in the strategic, clinical and operational aspects of these incidents, our alumna Christine will reflect on what she has learned personally as a leader, as well as the lasting impact on the hospital and the community. Many of the lessons learned also are applicable and had an impact with the COVID pandemic. So I'm going to hand over to Christine.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. It's absolutely lovely to be here. So I came up to Cambridge in 1981. I had rather a lot more hair and it was a different colour there. This was my matriculation photograph. I remember going to my matriculation dinner and Robin Matthews, who was then the master, gave a speech explaining how we were the absolute elite. We were the top 10% of the top 10% of all the intellects in the country, and we were all destined for great things. He also pointed out that some of us might meet a tragic end. The events that I'm going to describe to you, at one bit I thought the latter was probably going to be true. I read medicine when I was here. I trained as a gastroenterologist mainly in London, and my first consultant post was at the Homerton Hospital in East London. And I eventually moved to Salisbury as their medical director. Now, for the non-medics in the audience, so the medical director is the most senior doctor within an organisation in terms of hierarchy. I was quite young, actually, but and it's a board level position. You're an executive director of the organisation. You report directly to the chief executive, and you're responsible for the quality of care delivered across the trust and all things medical. Salisbury District Hospital is, for those of you who don't know it, it's quite famous now, but at the time it was a small rural district general hospital. It still is a small rural district general hospital, only about 450 beds, so about a third the size of Addenbrooke's. We had 10 critical care beds in our intensive care unit. The main part of the hospital was built in 1942 as a wartime hospital for the Americans, and therefore we still retain in Salisbury specialist interests in burns, plastic surgery and spinal injuries. And it's quite small in terms of activity as well, only about 65,000 ED attendances. So the trust that I'm at now, we have about 200,000 ED attendances across our 2 EDs in a year. It's a beautiful city to live in. It's very peaceful, very calm, lots of lovely outdoor spaces. The cathedral is absolutely stunning. It has a 23-metre high spire. And it generally speaking, when I took the job as medical director in Salisbury, I was told it was a lovely, quiet place to work and nothing very much. and I was really looking forward to a quiet life. However, we had then in March 2018, we had some considerable excitement when the beast from the east arrived. Now, I don't know if any of you remember this, but it was unseasonable cold weather with very heavy snow lasting for 2 days. And our hospital is up a long, slow hill, which meant that our ambulances couldn't get up the hill, our staff couldn't get up the hill, and our patients couldn't get up the hill. So we actually declared an internal major incident for those 2 days because we couldn't get staff and patients in and out of the hospital. And a large number of our staff ended up staying overnight on the Thursday night. We managed the incident in the usual way, and by the Saturday, it felt like things were back to normal. However, on Sunday the 4th of March, there was a man and a woman found on a bench outside the Mill pub in Salisbury, looking ill, and when they were brought into hospital, it was described that the woman had collapsed and fallen off the bench and was found on the ground, and the man was unresponsive, sitting up and probably fitting. They were brought in separate ambulances into the emergency department, and both of them required intensive resuscitation and were transferred to the intensive care unit. It was thought at the time that they might have had some sort of drug overdose. The area where they were found it does have young people particularly who are drug users in that area. And the police went and examined the bench where they were found that evening, and also went to their house. Overnight, the patients became increasingly unwell. They didn't respond to the usual intensive care support measures. They were developing worsening kidney failure. Their blood was becoming more and more acid, and they were becoming very unstable from a cardiovascular point of view. They also started sweating copiously, and caused a great deal of puzzlement to the team that were looking after them. The next morning, around the time the intensive care unit doctors changed their shift, there were 2 other patients who arrived in the emergency department who'd been connected with the incident. One of them was Sergeant Nick Bailey. The other one wishes to remain anonymous, and both of them at the time had eye symptoms. With the shift change in the intensive care, a very experienced intensive care doctor came on duty, and these patients were handed over. There was some discussion about what could possibly be causing the symptoms. And at that time, one of the police officers popped up to the intensive care unit and said, "Oh, I think you should Google Sergei Skripal, because all might not be as it seems." So they Googled him and discovered that he was a retired Russian spy, and started to think that this was not as straightforward as a drug overdose. The experienced consultant who came on said, "I think I've seen something like this before." He was old enough and experienced enough and had worked in rural hospitals for long enough to know the symptoms of organophosphate poisoning. Now, organophosphates are used as insecticides in animals, and occasionally in rural areas, farmers have become poisoned or contaminated with them. And he'd seen it. And the sweating triggered off a memory. And so they looked it up on UpToDate. So UpToDate is a sort of online medical textbook. And they started to think that this might be organophosphate poisoning. So one of them sent some blood off from the patients up to Porton Down and to the National Poisons Information Centre. We sent the blood to Porton Down because we know the folks at Porton Down. They're just down the road. They're really good at testing for weird and wonderful chemicals and really good at producing weird and wonderful chemicals instead. And about half an hour later, we got confirmation that this was indeed organophosphate poisoning. At around that time, we declared a major incident because we'd got 2 people who were poisoned. We'd had 2 other people attend the emergency department in connection with the incident who also might have been poisoned. And then at 10 o'clock, Wiltshire Police declared a multi-agency major incident, and investigators in hazmat suits started appearing in the city centre, covering up the bench that the patients had been found on. So the National Poisons Information Centre confirmed by the next morning that it was indeed, but we'd already had an indication from Porton Down. Nick Bailey represented to hospital extremely unwell the next day. And over the next period, we had 52 other patients who attended our emergency department with symptoms that they thought might be related to poisoning, but none of them were in fact confirmed to be poisoned. We eventually discharged Julia on the 10th of April and Sergei on the 18th of May, and stood down our major incident after 72 days, which was at the time the longest running major incident there'd ever been in the whole history of the NHS. But of course, you all know it didn't end there, did it? We had just completed the debrief after the first major incident, and on the 30th of June, the ambulance service was called to an out-of-hospital cardiac arrest in Amesbury. Amesbury's a lovely village. It's famous for a stone circle. I actually like the Amesbury stones better than Stonehenge, but so it gets plenty of tourists, and it is a really pretty village. It's about 10 miles, I think, from Salisbury. So the patient was brought in and was admitted to intensive care. And later that evening, her boyfriend, Charlie Rowley, was also admitted to our intensive care unit, extremely unwell, having collapsed at home. Once again, we didn't know that these incidents were connected, but eventually we tested them as well, and again confirmed that they'd been poisoned with a nerve agent. Sadly, Dawn Sturgess died on the 7th of July, but Charlie was discharged well home on the 20th of July. And we now know, don't we, that Charlie had found or acquired a fake Nina Ricci perfume spray and had given it to Dawn. She had sprayed it on her wrists and decided that it didn't smell of perfume. We think that the reason that Dawn died was dose-related because she'd sprayed it plentifully on her wrists, and we think that the reason Charlie survived was that he'd only got it on his hands when assembling the spray mechanism for the perfume. I want to talk a bit about how you run major incidents in the NHS, and a bit about how this incident actually worked from my perspective. So it's quite complicated, and whatever the incident is, it's run in the same way. So COBRA is the Cabinet Office Room B is what it stands for, which is the government response to incidents, and SAGE is the Scientific Advisory Group. So they take advice. Then within the NHS, there's a huge amount of cascade down an NHS hierarchy before the incident response really meets the people at the front end. And however, right from the very beginning of the incident, we were closely involved strategically, tactically and operationally in managing it. So I took the role of Gold Command, so that is making the senior strategic response to the incident from the point of view of our organisation. But as the incident was being managed by the police, and in fact by the end there were 5 different police forces involved, it was managed, the Gold Command Centre was the police headquarters in Devizes. Now Devizes is right in the middle of Salisbury Plain. It's about an hour's drive from Salisbury. The meetings were held in person twice daily, morning and evening. They were face to face. It was way before Teams video conferencing became common, and in fact we wouldn't have been allowed to. So the rooms were sealed for security purposes. You weren't allowed to take in your mobile phone, your laptop, your smartwatch, or Fitbit, or anything like that. Communication with the people in the room was by means of pieces of paper pushed under the door. Twice a day we were allowed out of the room, and we could make phone calls to our own incident control centre through a secure landline. And so it was quite difficult managing strategically an incident that was focused on my own hospital from an hour away through a landline, particularly during a fast-changing situation. I didn't have security clearance to do this. Nobody in the NHS has the level of security clearance that is needed to attend these levels of terrorist-related incidents. We'd been running the incident for a couple of months. And it was at the time that it first started to become clear that it probably was Russian spies that had done it. Before disclosing this, the police inspector chairing the meeting said, "Who has got level 3 security clearance?" People put their hand up, and he said, "Everyone else needs to leave the room." So I stood up to leave. He went, "Hang on, you can't go." And I said, "But I haven't got security clearance." He said, "It's okay, you've sworn the Hippocratic Oath." I felt I couldn't tell him I hadn't. So secure. So it was very secure. And the huge number of agencies involved meant that there was information in different places that was not necessarily being shared. So, for example, the first responders who attended the patients on the bench had got body cam video footage, which we never saw until in fact the wash-up meeting after the incident. And if we'd seen that video camera footage at the time, we would have immediately realised that this wasn't a drug overdose, that this wasn't a cardiac event, and that this wasn't a seizure. But that wasn't available to us at the time. In a fast-moving clinical situation, you need to make decisions quickly and respond to events. Scientists don't work like that. I presume I've got some scientists in the audience. Scientists don't work like that. They have to gather all the evidence, think very hard about it, do some calculations, create a few spreadsheets, look up a literature search, and then tell you that it's a risk-based clinical decision. And that was challenging. We wanted to know things like, well, how do we decontaminate the CT scanner that the patients have been in? Or because at the time they were picking up ambulances and towing them, wrapping them in cling film, towing them away and burying them in landfill. Well, we've got to use the CT scanner for some more patients. And the sort of prioritisation of what we thought was important compared to the wider piece was challenging to manage. So public health were concerned in case the watercourse had become contaminated, and they found there was a swan brought into a rescue centre very poorly, and they were obsessed with what was wrong with this swan, whereas I'm saying we've got clinical waste piling up in our intensive care unit. We'd have to give over one of the side rooms to store the clinical waste because nobody could tell us what we were meant to do with it. We didn't know that it was Novichok until the Prime Minister announced it in the House of Commons. However, in real life, it doesn't really matter what it's called. All of these nerve agents, sarin and so on, work in exactly the same way, and they work in the same way as organophosphorus insecticides. So therefore, we could use clinical first principles in treatment. We use the same drugs that you would use to treat the poisoned farmers. That's not to say that we didn't have an awful lot of experts offering us some rather unconventional agents to treat the patients with. We had a delegation of American military who came over to see us, bringing with them some countermeasures, which they advised we could use. We did put appropriate governance in place in case we needed to use them, but we didn't use them in the end. And there were international experts all over the TV telling us what we should and shouldn't be doing. What we did do is we set up our own clinical cell with known international and national experts, 4 of them, to give us clinical advice as and when we needed it. I had the interesting task of having to vet the CV and check the GMC registration of some highly famous international experts so that they could be in our clinical cell and give us advice. The clinical responsibility clearly remained, however, with our consultants, and the final decisions on any treatment rested with them. And that is challenging, isn't it? Because constantly you're trying to make decisions in an unknown scenario. We had to stop NHSE, Public Health England and the government wanting to ratify every single decision that we made because it just took too long. And at the same time, quite significant risks were left to local clinical judgment in the same way as a lot of decisions were in the COVID pandemic, who you could discharge, how you kept your services safe and so on. We asked the question about whether we needed to do any special decontamination of our emergency department and what we needed to do with the pulse oximeter probes that had been on the end of the patient's fingers. And they said, well, it's a clinical risk-based decision. So that was quite challenging for us. We had to make decisions quickly, but we didn't want decisions to be rushed. What did help is that 1 or 2 of these expert advisors did come to the Trust so that we could have face-to-face meetings with them, and they did actually meet the staff who were looking after the patients and the laboratory staff who'd been doing some of the testing, so that gave a certain amount of confidence to our staff. And of course, what we don't know is whether some of the decisions that we made at the time might be picked over by history and found to be wrong. I don't know what's going to come out of the public inquiry about our decision making at the time, but we made decisions as best we could given the lack of evidence in front of us. There were ethical challenges too. So initially, Sergei and Yulia, and indeed Nick, were unconscious and lacked capacity. And so we did appoint independent mental capacity advocates for them. On the 21st of March, the International Organisation for the Prevention of Chemical Warfare wanted to come and draw blood from both of the patients to test to see if it really was Novichok or whether it was some other agent. And give an independent opinion on that. We were not sure whether it was in the best interests of a retired Russian spy to have it proven that he had been poisoned by a Russian manufactured agent. So we did go to the Court of Protection, and the Court of Protection determined that it was in their best interests. And indeed, OPCW did confirm that the agent was definitely Novichok and not another nerve agent. It's quite hard to maintain security in a hospital. I was a bit more used to it in London when we did have some patients who required armed guard. But Salisbury in particular has got 5 entrances, all quite widely spaced apart, and it is a public building and you do need to allow the public access. We had armed, so fortunately the intensive care unit is down a corridor off the main hospital corridor, so we could station armed police at the entrance, and to give our staff confidence, we also used our own security staff who they knew well. We locked down the intensive care unit and only allowed people with the right security clearance to come in. We had, where other patients' relatives were visiting, they had to sign in and sign out and show an ID before they were allowed to come in. We audited access to the patient's records, and we did find that 1 or 2 people had accessed them that didn't have a legitimate interest in the patient's care. We took disciplinary action, and we publicised that we'd taken disciplinary action against those individuals. We got volumes and volumes of police information requests, which I, as the Caldecott Guardian of the Trust, had to deal with. We only released such information to the police as was necessary. And the police wanted to install recording devices and cameras in the patient's rooms in case they said anything interesting as they were regaining consciousness. We said no. They're not in a position to consent to do that once they have regained consciousness and capacity. If they agree to be interviewed by you, you can interview them, but we're not putting recording devices in our intensive care unit, thank you very much. And we did, so if any of you saw the TV footage after the patients were discharged, and myself or a colleague appeared and said we were delighted that Sergei had been discharged or Yulia had been discharged, no, we were pleased to announce that they were now fit for discharge. They'd actually been discharged, they were long gone at that point. And we managed to discharge them without anyone knowing when they went and where they went. I don't think I knew where they went, actually. We also had to keep running a hospital. So we didn't divert emergencies or close our emergency department. We didn't cancel any elective surgery. We didn't transfer any patients out of our intensive care unit. But we did have to double run our intensive care unit shifts. So again, a bit like COVID, we had one group of staff looking after the patients who were poisoned, a different group of staff looking after the rest of the patients on intensive care units, so there was no risk of cross-contamination. We did have to get a lot of extra staff. We also had to provide a lot of assurance to the public that our hospital was safe. I remember going down the corridor and there was a lady standing outside a ward not wanting to touch the door handle to go in the ward because she'd heard that there was Novichok on door handles. It was interesting to me how the press made all kinds of assumptions and judgment about the patients that we had. In the NHS, we're taught to treat the patient in front of you. And you treat all patients the same, regardless of their background, and you don't make any assumptions. That was not true of the police, and it was not true either of the press. If you think back to the press coverage, Nick Bailey was a hero, Sergei was a spy, Charlie and Dawn were hopeless drug addicts and alcoholics. And this narrative, making judgments about patients, I found quite difficult to deal with. And the different response when we came to discharge Charlie, who was homeless, so Sergei and Yulia were homeless, and all stops were pulled out to find them somewhere safe to go. I asked the agencies about where we should send Charlie when he was discharged. They said, well, he's homeless, you send him to the homeless hostel. I said, but he's only homeless because his flat is surrounded by police tape and nobody's allowed to go in it. And it did take a bit of persuasion that they had the same responsibility to Charlie as they did to Nick Bailey and to the Skripals. And just an illustration of that, police issue an urgent warning to drug users with a detective saying the couple may have taken a contaminated batch of drugs. That was Dawn and Charlie. They hadn't taken a contaminated batch of drugs. They'd poisoned themselves with a nerve agent. When it came to dealing with the COVID pandemic, that brought back to me the troubles that we had dealing with PPE during these incidents. So initially, because the Skripals had collapsed after eating, supposedly eating a pizza in Zizzy's, in fact, they'd had a drink at the Mill Pub. They went to Zizzy's for pizza. They got some more drinks there and they ordered a pizza. But the service at Zizzy's in Cambridge is notoriously slow, so they'd got fed up of waiting and gone out, and they were probably feeling a bit poorly by then as well. So they hadn't actually eaten in Zizzy's, but we thought they had, and we thought that the agent had been on whatever it was they ate. And therefore we thought that the main risk to our staff was from their bodily fluids. So we were very careful about dealing with their vomit and their urine and their feces, but in fact the poison had got in through their skin. It had been smeared on the doorknob of Sergei's house, and when we eventually started testing to find out where the poison was, they both had very heavy skin contamination. And so we had to change our approach to PPE because our staff had been in short gloves and short sleeves. Sergei's a big chap, so trying to roll him and turn him in the intensive care unit, we were very worried about our staff getting it on their skin. So in retrospect, we should have started with higher levels of PPE and downgraded it. However, the precautions that we took did protect all our staff, and none of our staff were affected. We tested a lot of staff, and none of them had been exposed to the agent, which just shows the benefit of universal precautions. But what was difficult was our staff are there in the omnipotent NHS plastic apron that prevents you from all known viruses, bacteria and nerve agents, whereas the people that they saw walking around town were in full CBRN kit. There were a lot of people who told us that nobody had ever survived nerve agent poisoning. In just the same way as during the COVID pandemic, we were told that the mortality of COVID was 50%. Neither of those things proved to be true, but it did mean that we had to plan for a worst case scenario. Our military colleagues were talking about full CBRN extractions of dead bodies and so on. We really wanted, when the patients died, we assumed that they would die, to do their last offices in the same way as we would any other patient and treat them with the same dignity that we would anyone else. We kept trying to change the protocol, and it was one of those things that kept having to go up the line, and the new protocol was never actually formally ratified. It was a very unnerving time for our staff. So at the time that our staff were treating the patients on intensive care unit, the police car that Nick Bailey had arrived in was being taken. It was parked on our ambulance ramp, which you can see out of the window of the intensive care unit. And a lot of military personnel in full CBRN kit came and wrapped it up in plastic and hauled it onto a low loader and took it away to be buried in a pit at Porton Down somewhere. And there are our staff in their omnipotent NHS plastic aprons dealing with the patients. So it was very unnerving. Our staff are mainly local residents, and each day when they were coming to work, they were walking past areas that were fenced off with hazard tape. Without exception, I think our media were excellent. It was daily headline news for months. Most of the news reporting in our media was very professionally done. One of our staff was doorstepped, but otherwise not. Our staff were offered money for stories, but didn't take up the offers. We absolutely insisted that we took control of communications. We were being asked so often for updates on the clinical condition of the patients that we had to insist that we gave a once daily condition report at 8 o'clock in the morning, every morning, and that could be shared widely. The same was not true of the international media. This is a Russian news reporter who came to our hospital. He accosted a couple of staff and said, "Are the Skripals here? Do you know where they are?" And the staff said, "No, I have no idea." And he then said that it was all a hoax and it wasn't true that the Skripals were in our hospital and we'd made it all up. In fact, the two members of staff were midwives. He'd come in the maternity hospital. They had no idea. Seeing some of the news footage made some of my intensive care staff intensely nervous. We were genuinely afraid at one bit that if they didn't survive, there was a risk of a major international incident. One of them did say, "Well, I hope they don't die, and I have not been responsible for starting World War III." The social media weren't quite so responsible. We were awash with conspiracy theories and trolls. I think we all got trolled. I'm a liar. And we did have to really support a lot of staff through some of this. The worst was in September. There was another CBRN incident at Prezzo's pizza place in the centre of Salisbury, where a young man had collapsed, frothing at the mouth and fitting, and his Russian girlfriend insisted he'd been poisoned by the Russians. In fact, it was a complete hoax. It's a complete hoax. We couldn't keep control of friends and family. This young woman purported to be a relative of Julia's. She was nothing of the sort. Charlie's brother came on the media with some particularly gory stories, all of which were untrue. And Charlie himself sold his story to the news media, and the version that he sold was somewhat embroidered. We made a point that we weren't going to respond to everything that was in the media. We just let that go. It was also pretty difficult to control all the various dignitaries that wanted to come and visit. Needless to say, we didn't want them tramping all over our intensive care unit. Equally, they wanted to take our intensive care unit staff for lunch in the town hall, and we did. They really need to be looking after the patients, so that was difficult to manage. I've reflected often, I think, about why we were regarded as, and we were successful in this. As I say, we were told that nobody had ever survived nerve agent poisoning previously. Initially, there was some suggestion that as a small rural district hospital, we weren't fit to look after these patients, and the patients should go to a major poisons centre somewhere. And then once people started to think about the logistics of moving very unstable, very ill patients who were covered in Novichok across the country, it was thought to be probably a better idea to leave them where they were. So I think there's a lot about preparedness, and you'll be hearing about this in the public inquiry for COVID. We'd done our EPRR training. We'd just done a tabletop exercise fairly recently, and we'd had the snow incident to practice with. So we were a fairly well-oiled machine in terms of responding to incidents. No matter where you are in the NHS, if you collapse, you will get absolutely top quality resuscitation and intensive care. And you can get that in a small rural district general hospital or a London teaching hospital. We all do it the same. And we were commended for that, and eventually our intensive care unit received an outstanding rating from the CQC. We had read, at one bit we used more or less the entire NHS supply of these drugs that are the antidotes to nerve agent poisons. But the NHS supply chain just kept them rolling, and we never actually ran out, and that was excellent. The link with Porton Down was very significant. Porton Down is a defence science establishment just down the road from us. We have the military connections in Salisbury are significant. A lot of our staff were reservists or ex-military, and therefore they had trust and confidence in the military response, and they also knew how to obey orders and how to keep their mouths shut. And that, I have to say, I have to commend every one of our staff that was involved in the incident. They kept the patient's confidentiality despite quite serious offers of large amounts of money. They trusted in their leaders and managers to keep them safe. And they carried on working without question. I did not have one member of staff who refused to look after any of the patients, despite the fact that we knew there was potentially a risk to the staff. And we saw the same in COVID, didn't we? So the staff were terrific. We also, Porton Down gave us a lovely machine that we could put in the ED, and we could test those 52 patients when they came in to see whether they had been exposed to the nerve agent or not. But I think most importantly, most NHS organisations have values that they all sign up to, and those were ours in Salisbury. And actually, I used them when I was thinking, well, are we keeping our patients safe by these decisions that we're making? And that linked with ethical first principles guided the decision making. I'm conscious of time and I want to leave a little time for questions, so I'm going to skip a few things. There's always triumph in adversity. And one of the things that really came out of this was bringing the community in Salisbury together. So the decontaminating the city, the regeneration that happened. 2 years later, Salisbury was listed as one of the best places to live in the country. There is no doubt that there are people who have made fame and fortune, and that maybe includes me, from these whole events. Not fortune. But I think having, as a hospital, you are the centre of your community. You're often the biggest employer in the community. You're an anchor institution in the same way as a university is. And we realised as part of this how important that link into our community was, and our community in turn realised how valuable we were to the community. And I think there's been a lasting beneficial legacy of all this for Salisbury. And that's all I wanted to say.